Hello and welcome back to the Thinking Mind podcast. Today I have with me Professor Sir Simon Baron Cohen, who is a Professor of Psychology and Psychiatry and Director of the Autism Research Centre at Cambridge University. He is the author of 600 scientific articles and 4 books, including 0 Degrees of Empathy and The Pattern Seekers, which we'll discuss today. He created the first UK clinic for adults with suspected Asperger syndrome that has helped over 1,000 patients to have their disability recognised. He was chair of the NICE Guideline Development Group for Autism for Adults and was chair of the psychology section at the British Academy. And in 2021, he received a knighthood in the New Year's Honours List for services to autism. Today I have with me Professor Sir Simon Baron Cohen, who I'm incredibly excited to talk to today because in the 3 years of having a podcast, we haven't yet had a podcast talking about autism spectrum disorder, which is incredibly important to me, but also I think to everyone. Today I'm hoping we can talk about autism, what it is, what causes it, and talk about magnificent work you've done over the past 30 years. I'm also hoping to talk about your book that you recently released called The Pattern Seekers, which I've really enjoyed reading from an informative point of view. But there are also some important themes that I'd like to talk to you about with you in terms of how we can think about changes we can make to our modern society to allow people with autism to flourish. I think that was a really important message I got from the book. And I hope that I can talk to you about that a bit later. But I think it's probably a good place to start for our listeners to ask you in your own words if you can describe for us what is autism or autism spectrum disorder or neurodiversity, because we have a lot of names for it now. And what do we understand at the moment causes autism?
Yeah. So first of all, Rebecca, thank you for inviting me to talk to you today. So I'm looking forward to our conversation, and we may as well sort of dive straight in because you've already used the term autism spectrum disorder. Although that's how it's known internationally, particularly in the US, here in the UK, we don't tend to use the term disorder. So that already kind of addresses one of the key questions about what is autism. Is it a disorder?
Yeah, that's one of the questions I wanted to ask you in a bit. So let's hold on to that, or you can talk about it now if you'd like.
Yeah. Well, may as well have see where this leads. But what I was going to say was, that I think of autism as a disability and a difference. So the disability side is in terms of social skills and communication, but also in terms of adjusting to unexpected change. Autistic people often prefer predictability and get quite stressed if things are unexpected. So on that side of things, autistic people are looking for support for their disability. But autism isn't just a disability. It's also a difference in the sense that autistic people think differently, they process information differently, they see the world differently. Some of those differences are nothing to do with disability. They're to do with strengths or even talent. So that's why I don't personally use the word disorder, unless I'm talking about one of the co-occurring conditions. That's maybe one really important point, that autism is often accompanied by co-occurring conditions. Some of them are sort of medical, like epilepsy or gastrointestinal pain. Some of them are to do with mental health, like depression or anxiety. Some of them are sort of other disabilities like ADHD or dyslexia. But it could be that the word disorder is relevant to one of those co-occurring conditions. The only thing that's causing the person to suffer or is causing distress, we might think of in terms of a disorder. But disability itself, I think, is more about, what can we be doing to provide reasonable adjustments to make life more for the person. And difference is all about acceptance and inclusion. You use the word neurodiversity. That I see that as part of difference. That this concept of neurodiversity, that brains come in different varieties, and different kinds of brains are not better or worse. They're just different. If we make space for difference, actually, then, if autism is one of those examples of neurodiversity, if we make space for that difference, then autistic people will flourish.
Absolutely. And in your book, you give examples of people with autistic traits, historic people with autistic traits, I think. Is that fair to say? Because obviously you can't diagnose someone without meeting them and talking to them. But people such as Albert Einstein, and you talk about Elon Musk as well, who has identified himself, I understand, as autistic, who have gone on to invent wonderful things, and our society wouldn't be what it is today without their ability to do that, which I suppose brings us onto your book, really, which describes the human capability that you describe in your book to systemize.
Yeah, well, the book sort of addresses the question about whether there's a link between autism and the, I think, very human capacity for invention. And the way I sort of think about invention is that when you're inventing something, effectively it's a tool of some kind, and tools can be simple or they can be complex, but tools are basically systems. And in order to sort of come up with a new system, you first of all have to be able to understand the system that's in front of you. And then you can start experimenting or playing with the system to see if you can change it, hopefully improve it, or come up with something new. And you mentioned, historically, when we look back at people who've been really good at trying to understand the system in the world, Stein and Musk you just talked about, but in my book I focus on Thomas Edison, who is known to have, known for his invention of the first electric light bulb, but actually he invented unstoppably. He was, so it's what I call generative invention. That what seems to characterize humans, modern Homo sapiens, for the last 100,000 years, is that we just invent once. We're constantly inventing. And some people are sort of stronger at this. And bringing this back to autism and people who've got a lot of autistic traits, the book explores how this psychological process called systemizing, understanding systems, and then sort of playing with systems to really explore how the system works. That seems to be something, it's just a kind of pattern recognition skill, seems to be something that autistic people just naturally gravitate towards. Even when you see autistic kids very young, they're often experimenting, they're taking things apart, putting things back together again, but really trying to understand, how does the system work? Why are things the way they are? So they can, and obviously this has nothing to do with disability. This is to do with, you could say originality. That, they're thinking afresh, not just doing what they've been told, following fashion, but they're often thinking afresh and trying to understand things from first principle. So there's a real opportunity, I think, that if we make the conditions right for autistic kids and autistic people more generally, that they could be achieving much more. But maybe this kind of leads us to the kind of reality of where we are today, which is that a lot of autistic kids have a miserable time at school. They feel that they don't fit in. They're not being made to feel comfortable. And it's kind of turned off education. And the kind of the way that plays out is with autistic people dropping out of school at high numbers, ending up unemployed, feeling very negative in terms of their self-esteem or self-confidence. So there's something wrong here. There's, when you look at these two different views of autism, on the one hand, their potential and their natural aptitude, and on the other hand, how they've ended up in society. Somehow we're failing autistic people.
Absolutely. I think it's a really important point. And I was smiling because at the beginning when you were explaining, how some autistic people or most autistic people really focus in on certain mechanisms, I can think of many young people that I've seen with that capability. But unfortunately, because I work in the mental health service, I've seen them struggling with their mental health because of all the other struggles that they have, because they've dropped out of school, they've become socially isolated. Then socializing becomes even harder. You mentioned unemployment as well. And it's a real problem. I think I read recently that attempted suicide, correct me if I'm wrong, attempted suicide in autistic adults is 1 in 4. Is that a correct statistic that you're aware of?
Yeah, I think, to be precise, I think 1 in 4 autistic people will plan or attempt suicide. Those statistics are alarming. And so we've pivoted a lot of our research here to think about what can we be doing towards suicide prevention for autistic people. So it's not just tackling the mental health part, which is a big part of it, but it's also about sort of where are the barriers for autistic people in education, in the workplace, in feeling included. Because, you've put your finger on it. If you're feeling isolated and feeling like you don't fit in, it's going to be a downward spiral in terms of mental health.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the book, you do discuss towards the end some of the ways in which we can think about improving the lifestyle of autistic young people in schools, such as allowing them to study their focus subject and not forcing them to study things that they're not interested in, because we know that autistic people struggle with doing demands that are placed upon them, especially if they're not interested in them. What are the ways in which can modern society adapt or change to enable autistic people to flourish?
Yeah. Well, since you've mentioned school, let's just start on that first. Because, mainstream school, and particularly the national curriculum in this country, but the equivalent in other countries, it carries with it a certain expectation that you learn in a particular way. So you'll remember from your own days at school that you're expected to kind of jump from one subject to the next, and by the time you're a teenager, you're expected to be juggling, 8 or 9 different subjects, switching topics every 30 minutes or however long the lesson is. Autistic people, their minds work differently. They often have a preference for depth over breadth. So once they kind of latch onto a topic, they like to go quite deeply into it. And it's actually part of the diagnosis, although I don't think it's a symptom. I think it's a quality that is actually a positive thing.
A different, not a disorder.
Yes, exactly. But but psychiatrists might refer to it as an obsession when the person's obsessed with a particular topic. Whereas, you could just call it, expertise, that they want to become an expert in it. And they want to get as much information on that one topic as they can. And, they set themselves quite high levels of, perfectionism, that the details matter, for an autistic person. They're not trying to just kind of understand something in a shallow or in a vague way. They want to understand it in a precise way and in a, with all of its complexity. And that learning style just may not be suited to the typical classroom where you're meant to drop one subject and hop over to another subject after 30 minutes just because the bell rings. You know, so we need to be thinking about, the way we deliver teaching and education to autistic kids. Is it really doing them any service, or is it actually disabling them? And the second thing, of course, is that the way traditionally schools have been set up is you learn from a teacher, and it's all about communication, and it's about sort of looking at the teacher's face, listening to their spoken language. So it's very much a kind of social activity, and you learn in a large group of other kids, where there might be lots of background noise and kind of giggling and chatting and stuff. These are the sorts of things that autistic people find really difficult, not just because they might have sensory hypersensitivity, but also, the social world is precisely the area that they struggle with, because it's changing so fast, and it's difficult to kind of get a foothold in terms of predictability in this world, and that they might flourish much better when they can learn through different formats. They might prefer to learn in a quiet environment, or with fewer people kind of interacting. It's discussion. They might prefer to learn through the internet or through books, but where they do a lot of fact checking, because autistic people get the facts clear and established. Less about kind of interpretation and opinion, and more about what are the facts. And that learning style you could imagine it could really lend itself to certain subjects that are factual, like the sciences or history, mathematics, etc. Not just those subjects. Many subjects could kind of benefit from taking this very factual, systematic approach. But we've got to somehow accommodate that autistic people have this different learning style. Otherwise, they feel like they're completely lost and turn away from education, which is what we see in very large numbers.
Yeah. And you mentioned someone in your book as well who was struggling to get a job. And I actually gave a talk to my fellow colleagues today on the application process for higher training. And one of the parts of the talk was talking about the interview. And I was thinking to myself, because I knew we were speaking this afternoon, I mentioned, talking about how to give eye contact over Microsoft Teams. And interviews are all about making eye contact, trying to work out what the interview wants you to say and responding to their social cues and their body language. And it's no wonder we think that unemployment rates are higher in those with autism, because interviews are structured. I mean, they're difficult at the best of times for neurotypical people who are under stress and anxiety. But someone that's neurodiverse, that struggles with all these social cues, I mean, it's really upsetting to think that I know in your book you describe some specific environments and companies that do cater to people with autism, but generally my knowledge is that we don't at all.
Yeah. But first of all, just before we come on to your important point, just to kind of a word about language, because you use the phrase people with autism, but actually talking to the autism community, there seems to be a preference for saying autistic people rather than people with autism. It's an interesting shift, because you say people with something, it sounds like maybe the old view of someone has a medical condition, they're living with a condition. Whereas I think this kind of change in language reflects more that autism is now seen as part of the person's identity. So rather than saying, I don't know, a person with black skin, we would say a black person, because it's part of their identity. So, that's just kind of a small point about language, but actually, it also reflects a bigger shift that's happened in recognizing that, we need to sort of think about what is the experience like for autistic people? It's, when it's affecting, who they are as a whole person. But back to your kind of point about sort of interviews and, job selection, you're right that at the point of, selection, that may be where they are experiencing a barrier to employment. And if we're expecting people to show social skills in interviews, that's actually going to discriminate against people with ability in social skills. Seems almost like it's not a level playing field when autistic people apply to jobs. The equivalent would be asking someone who's in a wheelchair as part of the job selection to walk up the stairs. That would be seen as discrimination on the basis of a physical disability, and yet that's exactly what we're doing when we're saying, is the candidate making eye contact? And so this is challenging our fundamental assumptions about how we recruit people into jobs. As we do that, we're not going to shift the statistic, which is that 85% of autistic adults are unemployed. 85%, that's got to be connected to the other statistic you mentioned earlier of one in four are feeling suicidal or, planning suicide. Unemployed, you're going to feel undervalued. You're going to be isolated or more isolated, potentially. Maybe you're not going to have autonomy because you don't have a wage, so you might end up kind of not living independently, even if you're capable of it. So employment is another big area, but I don't think the interview process is the only barrier to employment. But certainly one of them. But I think there might be other factors that either might be discouraging autistic people from applying. Do they feel that they're going to be welcome? Do they feel intimidated or overwhelmed by the nature of the workplace? But also, are they going to be met with, an attitude of respect and accorded the same dignity that everyone else would expect? Or are they going to experience more of that same stigma that they experienced when they were at school?
Yeah. It's interesting because I think if you compare where we are at right now with 30, 40 years ago, and I'm sure you can give a better perspective of this than I have, given your work over the past 30 years, about our understanding of autism, it has come far. But like you said, there are still, there's still stigma, and there are still massive barriers in our modern society. One thing I did want to ask you, because I think this must be the most popular question I get asked when I tell people that I work in a national specialist autism team, is why are the rates of autism increasing? It's probably, I imagine, a question you get asked frequently. And I know you touch on it in the book, but I would like to hear your answer today, please.
Sure. So just, for our listeners, autism is now diagnosed in 1 in 36 children. That's American data, but the rates seem to be pretty similar in other countries, including here in the UK. And that's a massive increase compared to if we went back 20 or 30 years ago, when we thought autism was quite rare, like 1,000 or, even less than that. And you're asking what's caused the increase. Well, a lot of it will just be to do with better recognition and greater awareness. So, awareness has kind of been driven up, which is a really good thing, just by more clinics being out there and people being trained about autism and, lots of stories in the media about autism, sometimes misinformation But there's more. There are more books, more movies, more documentaries. There's radio programs, podcasts. So I think it's really good that awareness is growing, and that's leading people to wonder: am I autistic? Should I seek a diagnosis, or is my child or my some other relative autistic? I think part of it is just that. Part of it, I think, is also we've changed the definition of autism over the years. So in the sort of mid-90s, we introduced this other category called Asperger syndrome. What I mean is the field of psychiatry, introduced Asperger syndrome, which really referred to autism without learning disability. Because before that, the majority of people who were receiving a diagnosis of autism also had learning disability. I think it was something like 3/4 of autistic people in the early 90s would have been, would have had a learning disability as well as being autistic. Today it's the absolute opposite. The majority of autistic people do not have a learning disability. Kind of broadened our definition, and I think that's probably a good thing too. The result is, as you know better than anyone, long waiting lists to get a diagnosis. That's another kind of crisis that the services, the National Health Service, social care, we need to address the long waiting lists, because it's great that we've got better awareness, but if it takes more than a year to get seen for a diagnosis, which is very common, during that time, people are sitting and waiting and maybe getting depressed, maybe feeling suicidal. So, it's unacceptable.
Yeah, absolutely. My further question, because we have touched on autism being a difference and also can lead to a disorder with associated anxiety disorders and increased rates of depression. Should everyone who has autistic traits be seeking a diagnosis, or should we only be seeking diagnoses or should people only be seeking diagnoses if they have traits as well as a negative impact on their day-to-day life?
Yeah, I think the latter, although people have different views on this. So we all have autistic traits. That's the first thing to say. So about 20 years ago, we developed a measure of autistic traits called the AQ. It stands for the Autism Spectrum Quotient. And it's quite widely used, but it's just a questionnaire. And it counts how many autistic traits you have. And it turns out when you give this questionnaire out to people in the general population, everyone has autistic traits. And it's just a matter of degree. That was an interesting surprise. Prior to that, we used to think about autism as a binary thing. You're either autistic or you're not autistic. So that shift towards a spectrum, not just within those who have a diagnosis, but a spectrum right across the population of autistic traits, I think just kind of acknowledges that autism isn't something mysterious. It's just people have more autistic traits than other people. But your question was, if you've got a high number of autistic traits, do you need a diagnosis? And I think the answer is no. It's only if autistic traits are causing you to struggle in some way. It's about whether you're coping or functioning in your everyday life. If you've got a lot of autistic traits, but you're actually comfortable and doing what you want to be doing, if you feel your quality of life is good, I don't think you need to be pursuing a diagnosis. And I think if you find yourself in an environment where actually your autistic traits are valued, again, you don't need a diagnosis. It may even be that because there's a good fit between you and your environment, there's no real disability that is evident. It may only be that, with that level of autistic traits, if you suddenly moved into a different environment, you might suddenly struggle. And so that's more about sort of not just looking at the individual, but looking at their surrounding, how they're being received, how they're being supported, how they're being celebrated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned some of your research, and I did want to talk to you before we finish about some of the important findings that you've made over the past 20, 30 years. I don't know if I'm getting the numbers right. And one of the interesting studies you've done, well, there were two. You came to the IPPN as an expert. Actually, it was on Teams, so you didn't come a few years ago. And I remember for a journal club as an expert. And one of the studies you presented, which you talk about in your book, was looking at people's ability to systemize compared to their ability to empathize. And I think the findings are really interesting and important. Are you able to summarize that study for our listeners?
Yeah. So we've done a number of studies in that area, but this is really looking at the psychology of autism. And also the psychology of all of us. So we've talked a little bit about systemizing, but systemizing is the ability or the interest to analyze how systems work and to predict how they'll work as well. Systemizing also involves kind of building new systems. And we could just think of this in quite practical ways. It could be sort of how you organize things in your life. That's, it might be more or less systematically. How you file things, how you put your possessions away, whether it's kind of chaotic or in a kind of systematic way. So systemizing is kind of part of everything we do, but autistic people often have a strong interest in system. It might not always be apparent if you kind of just looked at, how they're living. So it could be that they're living in a very messy kind of home life, but actually what they're doing is being really focused on one or two particular systems, like collecting information very systematically, or trying to really understand a particular computer game in huge detail. So that's about systemizing. Empathy is a word that, is closer to the English language, and, empathy is about being able to recognize what someone else is thinking or feeling, but also respond to what someone is thinking or feeling with an appropriate emotion. Autistic people might struggle with the first part of that. That's sometimes called cognitive empathy. They may not be able to read other people as easily as others, reading their facial expression or decoding tone of voice, for example. So it doesn't mean that they lack empathy, because often they're absolutely fine at the second part of empathy, which is once someone tells them what they're thinking or feeling, they do have the appropriate emotional response. So if they hear that somebody else is in pain, for example, or sad, they want to know how they can help. They have the same emotional response that anyone else does. But, the study that we conducted was, first of all, to look at different levels of empathy and systemizing in the population. We actually tested this using some online measures, so we were able to get big data. Something like 600,000 people took part. Those were people who weren't autistic. And what we found was that there were gender differences. So on average, women scored higher than men on empathy measures. And on average, men scored higher than women on systemizing measures. We also had 36,000 autistic people took part. So at the time, we published it in 2018. I think it was one of the largest studies of autism. And we found that autistic people, as we predicted from smaller scale studies, they scored lower on the empathy measure, but they actually scored higher on the systemizing measures. And so these are kind of just studies that help us to, I suppose, in a way, to see the neurodiversity, that all these different profiles, psychological profiles in the general population, and it's just one of many profiles that exist. And somehow, just tying this back to our earlier conversation, somehow we've got to make sure that different areas of society make space for those different profiles, whether we're talking about the classroom at school or the workplace or colleges and universities, or just kind of more widely in society, like the health service. Are we really sort of making sure that all of these different places in the world are equally accessible to people with these different profiles?
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned there were sex differences seen in the research, and I know that you've done a lot of research looking into the sex differences and the effects of hormones. Are you able to summarize some of that research very quickly for our listeners today?
Yes, of course. Keeping it brief, when you find differences between people with different genders, that could all be the result of our experience and of culture. But what we've been interested in is to find out if some of those sex differences also reflect prenatal biology, and particularly prenatal sex steroid hormones like testosterone and estrogen, which are known to change brain development. We've been studying that, and across several studies, we've found that autistic people have higher levels of prenatal sex steroids. So these are kind of hormonal changes that are probably interacting with the genetic predisposition, because we know autism is partly genetic. And in combination, genes and hormones are changing brain development. We also have looked to see whether these hormonal variations are relevant to the general population. So when we see differences in empathy or systemizing, we've been able in some studies to show that over and above the role of postnatal experience, prenatal sex steroid hormones are also associated with how you perform later in both of those areas.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting, and I can appreciate. Actually, I won't go into the controversy around people that have commented on that. Actually, I'll cover that.
Well, I think the area of gender differences and sex differences is inevitably going to attract controversy, maybe for good reason, because we know that historically women have experienced discrimination in lots of parts of society, and any kind of science that might be looking at whether these differences between genders are partly biological is going into territory that is likely to be controversial. But as scientists, we have to also separate what we want in terms of political aspirations, which is always about equality, from understanding what's, for example, causing more boys than girls to get diagnosed with autism or language delay or ADHD or a whole range of disabilities.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's really important to separate the politics from the science, I suppose, because we can look at them in different lenses and appreciate them for what they are separately.
So I think it's important that scientists are actually very explicit about their values, and that's that helps to frame the science that you do, helps to almost sort of explain why you're doing the research that you are doing. So in the case of us looking at hormones, for example, we're not doing that work to justify historic sexism, which would be appalling. we're not doing that work to develop a prenatal test for autism, which I think would be equally appalling because of the risk of that leading to eugenics. But we can state our values about valuing diversity, or whether it's neurodiversity or any other kind, whilst at the same time pursuing some of these quite challenging scientific questions.
Yeah, and you mentioned we're not doing this to enable testing for autism, which I think is important. If we bring it back to the book, you discuss how the ability to systemize has been critical for the evolution of humans, and without it, well, no other species has had this ability, and that's why we have become what we are. I'm conscious of time, but are you able to briefly explain that to us, and then people can read the rest of the book to understand?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the book, introduces evidence from archaeology. So, if people are interested in, the evolution of invention, the capacity for invention, it takes us all the way back to our hominid ancestors who were using simple stone tools like rocks as hammers or axes to cut and to scrape. But it also kind of explores what happened in the last 70 to 100,000 years, where we suddenly see the rate of invention taking off, where we're no longer seeing the production of simple tools, but we're seeing the invention of complex tools, like the first musical instrument, or the first sculptures, or cave paintings, and so forth, through to today, where our world is absolutely full of inventions. And that seems to be what makes humans unique amongst the animal kingdom, that we invent unstoppably. And linking this back to autism, it takes us through the evidence that autistic people may be not only sort of more interested to systemize, to invent, but also that there are all kinds of interesting links between autism and invention. Some of them, I'll just give you a flavor of two of these studies. So one of them was looking in places like Silicon Valley. We actually studied rates of autism in a Silicon Valley in the Netherlands. It's called Eindhoven, because Silicon Valley and Eindhoven have been attracting people who have an aptitude for invention and for understanding systems. You might expect, if autism is partly genetic, and if the genes for autism are linked to an aptitude for understanding systems and inventing, that we'd see higher rates of autism in places like Silicon Valley or Eindhoven. And that's exactly what we found. But we kind of followed that up to look at the molecular genetics by working with a company called 23andMe, which some of your listeners will have heard of. It's a personal genomics company. You pay $100, you spit in a tube, you send off your saliva, and they tell you what your DNA, what genes you're carrying. And what we were able to do working with that company is ask people who were clients of the company to take a systemizing test online, so that we could first of all look at the genetic associations with an aptitude to systemize, and then look to see whether there was any overlap with what's known about the genetic associations with autism. And actually we found a significant overlap between the two. So, this kind of, again, the results of this for me were sort of really exciting, because first of all, it was showing that when we look at the genetics of autism, we shouldn't be assuming that these are genes that cause disease or disorder, because some of those genes are associated with talent in pattern recognition and understanding systems. But it's also showing that since the genome is much older than just contemporary society, our genes haven't changed that much. That if we're trying to understand how did we end up being a species that is so successful when it comes to invention, that the evolution of invention is closely tied to the evolution of autism, even in our DNA.
Yeah. I'm going to finish on one of the quotes from your book, which I think brings us slightly back to what we were talking about at the beginning, which is actually a quote that someone said to you, but I think it really resonates with some of the things we've spoken about today. So you say, as one Danish autistic man told me, we are like freshwater fish in salt water. Put us in salt water and we flail around, suffer, struggle, and may even die. Put us in fresh water and we flourish. And I think we'll finish there. Professor Sir Simon Baron Cohen, thank you so much for coming on. I've absolutely loved talking to you today. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks very much, Rebecca.
Thanks so much for listening this week. If you've got any feedback, as always, do get in touch. If you enjoyed the episode, why not give us a rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, because it really helps other people to find us. If you want to get in touch, you can find us on Instagram or Twitter, or you can drop us an email. And if you value the show more generally, why not buy us a coffee? Thanks so much.